Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the CLC lecture, Conquering the Rising Mercury Cities Lead the Way. My name is Eugene. I'm your MC for today. Wishing everyone a very good morning. So today, the CLC lecture series is a lecture series that the Center for Livable Cities has set up as part of our mission to create, distill, and share knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. And this morning, we are delighted to have Mr. Mark Watts, Executive Director of the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, or C40 for short. Right? Today, he'll be presenting on how cities are using innovative measures to tackle climate adaptation and how multi-sector collaboration is the key to ensuring success. Right? So the format for today's lecture is a few parts. We'll invite Mark Watts to present for a short, about 30 minutes, and then followed by a Q&A session that's led by our moderator, Ms. Jessica Cheam. I think she's no stranger to everyone. She's the managing editor for Eco-Business and also adjunct research associate for CLC. So for this period, please hold your questions until the Q&A session. I think with this, probably we'll invite Mr. Mark Watts to present. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and it's lovely to be back in Singapore. I haven't been here for a couple of years. Today I was going to focus primarily on the risks of climate change that we see across the C40 membership cities, and I'll explain a bit about who we are in a moment, and how we see the major cities around the world adapting to what are now the inevitable consequences of climate change. And perhaps not talking so much about what is being done to reduce emissions, although clearly that is the centerpiece of anything to do with climate change, and maybe we can talk about that in the questions. So just to start, because C40, we're a climate organisation, but solely focused on working with the major cities of the world, and sometimes we still get asked why that is the case. It's very simple, really. Two things. One, that 80% of global carbon emissions are generated in cities around the world, and that keeps rising as more and more countries urbanise. But secondly, and I sometimes think more importantly, given the continued failure of intergovernmental action on climate change, not that there aren't some governments that are making real progress, and we work with a number of those around the world, and I can see our friends from the Danish embassy are here among them, and of course Singapore. But whilst that intergovernmental process has got stuck again past the Paris Agreement, where we really see political leadership and the ability to collaborate on a global scale to tackle climate change working best is amongst the mayors of the great cities in the world. And C40 is one of the organisations that brings together those cities where, despite our name, we were once a membership of 40 of the world's greatest cities. We're now 94, but it is cities, generally speaking, that are very large, 3 million plus population, the capital cities of their nation, or the centres of economic development within those nations. You can see, possibly, the little dots on the screen, that it's very much a global organisation, roughly 50-50 split between global north and global south. Across the C40 cities, we represent 700 million people. A quarter of global GDP is generated in those cities. And we have an elected leadership, and the current leader is the Mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo. Whilst our headquarters is the little dot in the United Kingdom in London, which is where I'm based, I'm very pleased to say we have a growing office here in Singapore. And perhaps I've got some colleagues in the audience. I'm not sure where they all are, but if maybe they just want to stand up just so you can see who they are. We have a few people based here in Singapore, so that's 4 out of the 5 in this little quadrant here, and a growing force. So in terms of what we're trying to achieve at C40, I guess the most important thing is to demonstrate that by working with the places where most people want to live, the big exciting cities of the world, Singapore, London, Beijing, Paris, New York, Tokyo, that if it's possible to really tackle climate change in those places, to reduce emissions at the pace that's necessary, and to demonstrate that you can do so while having incredibly strong economies and wonderful places to live, then that will be a way of convincing the whole of the world to take climate change more seriously. And someone else has said it much better than that. Al Gore, the former Vice President of the United States, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on climate change, he spoke at an event of ours a few months ago in San Francisco, and he said this wonderful line: "I wish you could feel the emotion that I have in my heart when I tell people about all the hope that is being generated by the C40 cities. The world is looking to you." And that's what we are trying to achieve. So that's the advert for C40. Now moving on to the substantive stuff. So for most of us probably in this room who've been focused on the problem of climate change for many years, the science has been very clear for a long time. But now it is clear beyond all doubt, I think, after the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published at the end of last year, which showed very clearly that there is a science-based target for constraining global temperature rise, and it's 1.5 degrees. We can't allow global temperature to go more than 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average without the huge, huge risk of runaway climate change that we'll never be able to bring back to a place that we have an ecosystem that human civilization could plausibly survive at scale. And I think that's the things to really focus on, and perhaps I'm going to do more than I normally would in a talk today, that the threat of climate change is about humanity being wiped out, human civilization no longer existing. It's not about some reduction in our quality of life or a reduction in our ability to move forward. It's about the destruction of the human species as we destroy the ecosystem that has made it possible for us to survive and thrive for actually a very small proportion of the Earth's existence, really the last 200,000 years or so, and only 5 or 10,000 years of what one might plausibly call civilization. And that report looked at the difference between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming, which had previously been taken as really the political target, the kind of headline number from the Paris Agreement. And we saw that at 2 degrees of warming, there are really catastrophic consequences for humanity and our ecosystem. Hundreds of millions of more people being plunged into poverty, extreme destruction of our ecosystem, 99% of coral reefs upon which much of marine life depends being wiped out at 2 degrees of warming. So we know what the target is, 1.5 degrees, and you can see the second report on the screen there is a report that C40, along with our partners at the Global Covenant of Mayors, published to try and translate that global scientific report into a summary for what needs to happen at an urban scale. And as I said, I'm not going to talk a lot about mitigation today, but at C40 it's right at the forefront of what we do. We've set out a science-based roadmap for our member cities to what needs to be done to deliver on the high ambition and urgency of the Paris Agreement. And what the graph is showing you is first what business as usual looks like, and that shows you that by 2030, so 10 years' time, 11 years' time, if our member cities carry on as business as usual, they'll have consumed their entire carbon budget, the total amount of carbon that they could legitimately risk putting into the atmosphere for the whole of the century. And if they carried on past 2030 on that trajectory, just our 94 member cities would have consumed the whole world's carbon budget for the whole of the century by 2060. And we've mapped out what needs to happen to avoid that scenario, to stay within the Paris Agreement boundaries. And it means, broadly speaking, across C40 cities, and indeed for the whole of the world, actually, emissions need to peak by end of next year. And at the moment, they're still rising. 60% increase in our emissions since the first intergovernmental treaty, the Kyoto Protocol, was signed over 20 years ago. And we thought they might have tapered off a bit in the last couple of years, but actually last year the numbers started rising again. So we've got just over a year and a half to stop emissions rising and start them coming down. Then global emissions per person in C40 cities need to come down from about 5 tonnes per person today to 3 tonnes per person by 2030. And 5 to 3 doesn't sound very much, but it's a 40% reduction in emissions in 11 years, in the context that most of our cities, their economies are growing strongly and their population is growing strongly. And then, of course, get to net zero by 2050. But there is a very positive side to all of this, because it's not just a kind of argument to make it more palatable to focus on climate action, but now the evidence is increasingly strong that the cities and the countries that get on a low-carbon development pathway most quickly will achieve the strongest economic development, their citizens' lives, standard of living will improve the fastest, and they'll be best placed to deal with what are now the inevitable consequences of climate change, as well as being able to reduce other negatives of modern human life, such as growing inequality. So we see a programme of staying within that 1.5 degree boundary of being about green jobs, about happier lives, cleaner air, and cleaner water. And indeed, I've just spent the last week in China. I think President Xi gets it exactly right when he says it's the ecological civilization. That's what we are aiming for. So in terms of how we're trying to achieve that in C40 and where I see a real reason for optimism, and I'm very much a climate optimism, it's on the collaboration that we see around the world between cities. And again, I won't go into this in great detail, but the process in C40 between our members is really about turning data into action. We're really very much data-driven, starting from science, starting from data about emissions and where they come from in cities right now, but then through a process of sharing best practice between cities, seeing that delivers faster and more impactful results. So a general way we work is, first of all, we identify cities that are the leader in whatever the field might be, whether that's electric buses or whether that's constraining flood risk within a city. And pretty much every city within C40 is a leader in something. Sometimes they don't know that they're a world leader in something, but they always are once one looks deeply enough. So we try and bring together that best practice, share it between the cities. Often that's on a thematic basis, so 16 separate networks within C40 across waste and buildings and energy and transport, and they all hold regular workshops so that city officials and political leaders are talking to each other on a regular, very regular basis, study tours between cities, and obviously events that bring them together. Increasingly now joint projects, so where cities are either going out to the market together. We've been doing that with with bus manufacturers to try and convince them that there really is a massive demand now for zero-emission buses, and none of our cities want to carry on procuring diesel and petrol-propelled buses, or whether it's research to look at the benefits of climate action. I'll talk about the fourth one in a moment, declarations. So people sometimes scoff at politicians making pledges about things that will happen in the future, but actually it's, we think, completely critical to drive action, to put strong policy in place so that then you can plan for the way that you want to develop in the future and send signals that change global markets. And then finally, providing very deep levels of technical and political advice to cities on how to deliver their programs. So that element of cities making commitment is one that I think is increasingly important, so that we get commitments that reflect the ambition of the Paris Agreement. So what we've tried to do in C40 is work back from that global target, 3 tonnes per person by 2030, and look at generically across the globe, what are the policies that you would typically need to see in place in cities if that target was to be met. And at the moment, we've got 3 buckets. There'll be more to come. So first on that is looking at buildings and the energy consumed in them, because across C40 as a whole, 60% of the carbon footprint comes from energy consumed in buildings. And so we have a target that all new buildings need to be zero carbon in operation by 2030. And indeed, all buildings, writ large, the ones that already exist, zero carbon by 2050, but there's a kind of advanced group within that in C40 that have committed to retrofit all of the publicly owned buildings so that they are also zero emission by 2030. So about 26 cities, along with some states and regional governments, have so far made that pledge. Secondly, another 26 cities have committed to only procure zero-emission buses by 2025 at the latest, meaning that their whole fleets will be zero-emission by around 2030, and that either the whole of the city or a major zone of it will be completely free of fossil fuel-powered vehicles by 2030 also. Now here is an interesting one, having just been in China, because that 2025, only procure zero-emission buses by 2025 at the latest, is seen as quite a tough target in most cities outside of China. The largest number of electric buses in any one city outside of China is in Santiago in Chile, 200 buses. About next is 160 in London. In China, on the other hand, the entire 16,000 fleet of buses in Shenzhen is already electric. In Beijing, the whole fleet of 10,000 will be fully electric by next year. In Nanjing, the same. I could go through the whole list. Chinese cities will have fully electric bus fleets within the next couple of years. The same is true already for their motorbikes, and most of their taxi fleets are moving in the same direction. And then thirdly, 25 cities, states and regional governments that have committed by 2030, and this is the complicated one, at least 15% less waste will be produced by each citizen. The total amount of waste sent to landfill or incineration will be halved compared to 2015 levels, and a 70% diversion rate in total agreed. This is the more complicated one. Obviously, we're on the way to zero waste to landfill and a circular economy. But here you see the real variations between cities in the global south that need to first collect waste and very high levels of recycling that exist in some of our western cities. So that's kind of the mitigation bit that I just wanted to give you a kind of sense of where the overall targets. What I really want to focus on now is how cities are, the risk that cities are facing from climate change and how they are adapting to it. I'm going to start here. Let's see if I can get to this, which I wouldn't normally do, but I want to read something out to you from a book that I read on the plane over here, in fact. And many of you may be reading it at the same time. It's David Wallace Wells' book, The Uninhabitable Earth, which I highly recommend to everybody. But here's his take on how humanity has failed to recognize the impact that climate change is already having on our world. So he says, the summer of 2017 in the Northern Hemisphere brought unprecedented extreme weather. 3 major hurricanes arising in quick succession in the Atlantic, the epic so-called 500,000-year rainfall of Hurricane Harvey, dropping on Houston 1 million gallons of water for nearly every single person in the entire state of Texas. The wildfires of California, 9,000 of them burning through more than 1 million acres, and those in icy Greenland, 10 times bigger than those in 2014. The floods of South Asia, clearing 45 million people from their homes. Then, the record-breaking summer of 2018 made 2017 seem positively idyllic. It brought an unheard-of global heat wave with temperatures hitting 108 degrees Celsius in Los Angeles, 122 degrees in Pakistan, 124 in Algeria. In the world's oceans, 6 hurricanes and tropical storms appeared on the radars at once, including one Typhoon Mangkhut, apologies for the pronunciation, that hit the Philippines and then Hong Kong, killing nearly 100 and wrecking $1 billion in damages, and another, Hurricane Florence, which more than doubled the average annual rainfall in Northern Carolina, killing more than 50 and inflicting $17 billion worth of damage. Then there were the wildfires in Sweden, all the way into the Arctic Circle and across so much of the American West that half the continent was fighting through smoke, those fires ultimately burning close to 1.5 million acres. Parts of the Yosemite National Park were closed, as were parts of Glacier National Park in Montana, where temperatures also topped 100 degrees Celsius. In 1850, the area had 150 glaciers. Today, all but 26 are melted. By 2040, the summer of 2018 will seem like normal. And I read that out because I think particularly those of us in the climate professional world, we've conditioned ourselves so much to talk about the optimism and the positive future that can be achieved through a low-carbon world that we forget not only the threat of climate change, but actually it is already happening. We are already in the midst of the biggest crisis that humanity has ever faced. And indeed, we really see that when we look at the evidence across the C40 cities. We've just had 1 degree of warming above the pre-industrial average so far, but last year when we look at our C40 cities, 84 of our 94 member cities are already experiencing what you could call a new climate reality, conditions that are so different from the average of what went before for the previous 200 years that it's clearly a new era. So you see, to give some examples, in the city of Lima, in Peru in 2017, the worst flooding in living memory, where desert soil has such a low infiltration capacity, flash floods and landslides left more than 16,000 people homeless and washed out almost 4,000 kilometres of roads, with a 1% reduction in the national GDP as a result of these flooding, equivalent to $7 billion worth in British pounds of impact. And that experience of flooding in Lima is not at all unusual. In fact, flooding has quadrupled in the world since 1980. And just in the last 13 years, it has doubled. And I really struggled when I saw that statistic, because what does that mean in human terms? 2.3 billion people in the world were affected by flooding last year. 157,000 died. If you then look at drought and the reduction in fresh water, half of the world's population depends on seasonal melt from high elevation, snow and else. Even if we do hit the Paris Agreement target, so even if we stay within 1.5 degrees, the Himalayas will lose 40% of its ice by 2100. And the United Nations view is that over 5 billion people will have less access to fresh water by 2050. We almost saw a day zero in a prosperous African country, Cape Town, last year, when it looked like the city was going to run out of water, something that they just managed to avoid. And then we come to the problem of wildfires, which is something that's particularly now affecting California and the United States, and showing that even in the wealthiest countries of the world are not immune from the impacts of climate change. And again here, the global figures. Of the 10 years in human history with the most wildlife activity on record, 9 have occurred since the year 2000. Each year globally, between 260,000 and 600,000 people die from the smoke from wildfires. And in the Amazon, which in 2010 suffered its second supposedly 1 in 100-year drought in the space of 5 years, 100,000 wildfires were burning in 2017 alone. And this is, of course, the Amazon rainforest, which takes in a quarter of all the carbon that's currently that we emit. Los Angeles, a city that I visit very regularly, very active within C40, has experienced really at the fine point of wildfires in California, with 7,000 buildings destroyed last year. I promise this is not all going to be doom and gloom, but actually we don't talk about it nearly enough, I don't think, in terms of the consequences that we're already facing. You know what's happening in this region much better than I do, but when I look across the C40 cities, the statistics I see, half of our members, 7 out of 14, experienced heat waves in the last year. Seoul has had an abnormal cold wave, a reminder that global heating messes up all of the weather systems. That doesn't mean we experience it just as heat, but also extreme cold. 10 out of 14 cities experienced problematic flooding. 3 out of 14 heavy storms and precipitation. Sydney seems it's forever in a drought now, and Jakarta, where I was a few days ago, extreme landslides. So we've been looking at that across the whole of C40, and first looking at the worst case scenario. What is the future that we need to avoid, the future that we don't want? And so working with a number of partners, you can see the logos on the bottom, we modelled what would happen if emissions carry on rising just in line with the current commitments by national governments. And that showed to us that we would have 2.5 billion people living in over 1,600 cities where national food supply is threatened by climate change, power supply affecting 470 million people in 230 cities vulnerable to sea rise, and 650 million people at risk from drought. So how do we avoid it? Here comes the positive bit. So first, and I'm going to be interested to learn more about this when I'm here. I only arrived at midnight last night, so I haven't picked up a huge amount of local knowledge yet. But in Singapore, we see programs about revitalising the water bodies, widening the floodplains so that you're better able to cope with flash flooding and rising sea levels. And I think a working with nature, which is a policy that we're seeing used a lot more in cities around the world. I spent a lot of time in China in the last few days with the deputy mayor that is responsible for water management and indeed energy also in Joburg. And he told me a very interesting story, which is whilst the world was focusing on day zero for water supply in Cape Town, actually Johannesburg came very close as well. They got down to just 15% of water remaining in their reservoirs. But they've managed to avoid the scenario of Cape Town and feel pretty confident that they will do in the future through a series of foresight, I would say. So this is a city where, unusually for an African city, the potable water is 100% certified clean, a fact of which they are extremely proud. But 40% of their potable water is lost in transmission from the pumping stations through to consumers, which is an extraordinarily wasteful level. 107 billion litres of water lost each year. And that's partly because of kind of faulty pipes, but it's also a product of the way that water is used. They have very high water consumption, so 340 litres of water consumed per person today, when across many parts of Africa, the number is 20 litres per person per day. So what they've been doing is first is a war on leaks. So they've set up essentially kind of crack teams based around the city that respond to a hotline. Whenever a leak is reported, a burst happens, they get in there and shut it down immediately, whereas previously they might carry on bursting for days at a time. Secondly, they've got a permanent hosepipe ban. So it is illegal now in Joburg to water your garden using a hosepipe, and they've imposed very high charges on the many golf courses that are across the city, and are introducing city-wide metering. All policies that are probably quite normal in Singapore or in London, but were very unusual in the South African context, and they've managed to avoid that day zero scenario in their case. Looking at a different scenario in a very different city, in the city of New York, a city that gets very, very cold in winter, but extremely hot and oppressively hot in the summer. And indeed, extreme heat now becomes a major cause of death and illness, even in one of the richest cities of the world. And so it's actually a very low-tech solution that the mayor is employing here in New York, which is first, and it's a policy that's stretched from Michael Bloomberg when he was mayor through to Mayor de Blasio now. First is just a massive program of tree planting across the city, and in Mayor de Blasio's program starting with the very poorest communities. Secondly, a program of outreach, just to get temperature monitors in the homes, particularly of the vulnerable older people, so that they know when the temperature is getting too high, and if they don't have air conditioning that's good enough in their own homes, know where to go, where they can be in a colder environment. And then the one that Mike Bloomberg himself always talks about, Mike is the president of our board, painting the roofs of New York white. So as you fly into New York now, you'll see that most of the buildings have got white roofs just to reflect that heat out. I love the kind of simplicity in this incredibly advanced city, the simplicity of their approach. In Beijing, that it's interesting, and I kind of threw this in just because I've been there for the last few days. You really get the sense now of that kind of ecological civilization being developed. And some people may scoff because people think of Beijing as polluted and China of all its coal-fired power stations, but I'm completely bowled over by the progress that's been made there. I hadn't been for about 18 months. I've been going to Beijing pretty much every year for the last 14 years. I've never seen a blue sky in Beijing before. I was there for 4 days and it was a blue sky every day. I have asthma. I've rarely been able to go out in Beijing because the pollution was so bad I was able to go for a jog on this occasion. Because they've closed down the coal-fired plants, because they've moved the industry out, but also because they've massively electrified their transport. I would also say Beijing is now as clean as Singapore. I didn't spot a piece of litter on the streets in Singapore. And a massive program of planting trees that are now just everywhere, giving a natural shading as well as taking out some of the pollution and adding some oxygen to the city. Moving now on to the very high engineering solution. So Rotterdam, along with Amsterdam and the Netherlands, known for their engineering prowess, a whole country that's below sea level that over the centuries has developed incredible engineering success in being able to reclaim land, expand their territory, and manage the risk of flooding. But now what you're seeing is a shift back from reclaiming land to giving land back to nature, to putting back natural floodplains, to allowing water back into the city, putting more green areas at the borders, because even the Dutch have reached the limits of humans' ability to engineer to protect against rising sea levels and rising flood levels. And I think that's particularly interesting in the context of what one sees happening around, and I'm missing the detail out here, but let's move on with the story. Elsewhere in the world, a bit closer to home here. Milag and I were with the governor of Jakarta last Friday, which, I mean, a city that seems to me just about the most threatened by climate change of any I've visited in the world, particularly because of the risk of flooding. 40% of northern Jakarta already below sea level, projected that 80% will be below in the next 15 years, partly because the whole city is sinking 7 centimetres a year because of the depletion of its aquifers. And you have to kind of keep going back up the story chain. The aquifers are being depleted because despite 13 rivers running into Jakarta, poor or lack of wastewater treatment and poor waste management over the years means that those rivers are polluted beyond the point of being usable, clogged up, so when the floods happen they all overspill and there's massive inundation of the city, and therefore both legally and illegally people are boring down into the aquifers, and as they bore down into the aquifers the city falls down. Here we have a solution. And in fact, it's a Dutch government and Dutch engineering that's providing the solution here. The so-called Great Garuda, possibly the biggest sea barrier ever built, a $10 billion project, 25 kilometers of seawall outside of Jakarta, and an innovative financing model that will pay for itself through reclaiming the land between the city and the barrier, and building 17 new islands in the shape of the national bird of Indonesia, the Garuda, thus the Great Garuda name, which will be sold for luxury housing to pay for the seawall, which sounds fantastic, doesn't it? Except for all of the modelling, not all of the modelling, a lot of the modelling now shows that it will have a disastrous effect on the environment of Jakarta, completely destroying marine life, building a stagnant pool of water where all these polluted rivers are flowing in at the heart of the city. And even that $10 billion seawall probably won't be enough to cope with a city that is sinking under its own weight and depletion of its aquifers. A far cheaper solution would be to clean up the rivers, introduce wastewater management, take the plastics out of the drainage ditches and allow the city to protect itself. And I think that's where one can see that some of the problems of 20th century logic being applied to 21st century problems of climate change. In this case, extraordinary engineering will be building a bridge to disaster rather than a bridge to a positive future. I have a feeling I must have gone on for too long here. I need to finish. Yes, I thought so. So in terms of what we're trying to do about the problems of adaptation in C40, well, first thing we do is try and raise the level of understanding of risk, which I talked about earlier through our research. Second is then bring all of our cities up to the level of thinking and skills on tackling adaptation as the best. And in that case, it means bringing our cities to Rotterdam, to Amsterdam, through masterclasses, which we now offer on a competitive basis to our cities, a 3 to 4 day programme where they bring the leading officials across all departments in the city to spend time in the Netherlands looking at the ways that they are now managing and have in the past managed their extreme flood risk, but also the risks of heat island effects also. But secondly, it's a big programme of inclusive climate action, which I think is very similar to that concept of the ecological civilization. The idea that it's not going to be possible to tackle climate change if we don't tackle poverty and inequality. Because you can't, the only way that we're going to be able to tackle climate change is a really systematic change in the way that the 7 billion people on Earth now live, or perhaps most importantly, the 10% of the population, the richest, which is probably all of us in this room, that have got the biggest responsibility for climate change, given that half of global emissions are caused by 10% of the population. And most of us think that's not us, that's the very, very rich. But if you earn over $50,000 a year, you're in that top 10%. And a big part of the problem, I guess that's most of us. And so our programme is really about how we engage cities so that they can engage with citizens and help make them part of the process of tackling climate change, but in particular making sure that when we adapt for climate risk, when we mitigate for emissions, those policies are first and foremost dedicated to the most vulnerable, to the poorest communities, so that the people who benefit most from reducing emissions, the people who benefit most and immediately from improved air quality are the people who suffered most in the present circumstances. And I'll finish with what I think is a real message of inspiration and hope personally at the moment, even though it may not sound it from the headline there, which is the extraordinary school climate strikes that are sweeping across the world and are really gripping Europe at the moment. In all the major capitals in Europe now, every Friday, tens of thousands, more and more children refuse to go to school because they say adults aren't taking climate change seriously, and there's no point being educated if there isn't any future. And the placard you can see here is one that I saw. I went to the Oslo school climate strike with the mayor of Oslo, and we just wandered around and we saw this schoolgirl. Her placard said, "You'll die of old age," meaning me and the mayor, "I'll die of climate change." And this real sense amongst younger people that their entire future is threatened. 2050 is well within their lifetime. 2100 they would expect to live and still have a good quality of life. And yet they hear these figures about the kind of world that we might be living in 2100. And the leader of this movement, a 16-year-old Swedish schoolgirl, Greta Thunberg, who's done an extraordinary TED Talk, which many people will probably have seen. She says she couldn't believe it when she was shown at school that the threat of climate change was as real as was being said, because if it was as bad as was being taught, then it would be the only thing that adults were talking about. Every time we turned on the news, the only thing that you'd see was how we were tackling climate change, and instead it was almost absent from adult conversation. And therefore she started a lone strike, just sitting on a Friday outside of the Swedish Parliament, refusing to go to school, until that's mushroomed into thousands of kids all across. And perhaps the strongest evocation of this I've heard was joining the climate strikes in Paris. And the young leader there, 17-year-old lad, was asked in a quite derogatory way by a journalist, "Why are you wasting your time doing this? Haven't you got better things to do when you're 17 and life is all ahead of you than worrying about climate change?" And in any case, a 17-year-old kid, what do you know about climate change? You know, if you really want to tell me about climate change, go away and study about it for 10 years. And he said, "The only mandate that I need to take to stand up and tell you about climate change is that I was born in the 21st century." And I think that's a message that we as adults need to think about really carefully. We've got the luxury of having the highest quality of life that humanity has ever known, and probably that will extend for most of the rest of our lives, even with climate change. But if you were born in the 21st century, you're facing a very different future, and we've got a responsibility to make sure that they enjoy a life as good as ours has been. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark, for a sobering yet inspiring lecture Sobering because you have highlighted the urgent need for climate action, and inspiring because you have shown that cities can actually take action, concrete actions to actually tackle this problem. Let me now invite Ms. Jessica Cheam for the discussion and Q&A session. For the Q&A session, if you have questions or comments, please raise your hand, and my colleagues will bring over the microphone to you. Mark and Jessica, please.
Thank you very much. Hi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be here back at the CLC lecture. It's one of my favorite lectures to moderate because we always get such good quality global experts coming to speak to us about some of the latest trends in the world. Mark, thank you for that presentation. It was very, very fascinating and insightful. I'm just going to start off the discussion with a few questions, and then we will open it to the floor and invite our guests today to engage with you. But really, you talked about Greta Thunberg and the strikes that we're seeing, and I think that's really interesting. In Singapore, it's illegal to strike, so we haven't really seen very much of that. I think in the international schools, there have been a few that have been trying to do that. But let's talk politics, because you're saying that the only thing that we should be talking about really is climate change. And in the cities and in the elections in Asia that we're seeing now, nobody is talking about climate change or about this crisis that we're facing. And so if you look at India or Thailand, Indonesia, we are actually, Ecobusiness, doing a story on the elections in Asia at the moment. Sustainability and climate change is absolutely not mentioned in any political rally or in the election campaigns. And if we are really, really facing that crisis, in your perspective and in your interactions with the mayors across the world, why is it not the top of the political agenda?
Yeah, this is probably the most frustrating thing. I mean, I think the only rational response to the science on climate change is to be terrified and to focus maximum human endeavour on solving the problem. And yet, as you say, we're quite clearly not doing that as a world. I think there's a bit of a responsibility here in the climate change world because I think we allowed ourselves to be cowed by the very sophisticated campaigning of the fossil fuel industry to kind of put us back in our place and only talk about climate change in terms of positives, hope, opportunity, green future, low carbon economy, all of which are true. Turn out it's true the world will be a lot better place if we started shifting towards a low carbon economy. But by not talking about the risk as well, the majority of the population don't have a sense, because their leaders aren't telling them, of just how terrifying a situation we're in. Across all of the C40 cities, the only mayor where I could say, looking at the elections that are currently coming up, that climate change is the top issue in the opinion polls and is the number one thing that the mayor is campaigning on, is in Oslo, in Norway. And it looks like that mayor will get re-elected. Let's hope so, because that would be a really great vision. But generally speaking, not only is climate not one of the big issues in any electoral context, it tends to be in the places that are most threatened by climate change, it's the furthest down the agenda. Normally because issues of immediate poverty and development are much higher. And the positive thing, though, is right across the world, and I meet with mayors and governors almost every week of my life, political leaders at a city level absolutely understand the threat of climate change, are really increasingly on top of the data and the information, and increasingly trying to drive programs in their city. They just don't feel really confident to have a conversation with their citizens about it.
Thank you very much for that. I really agree with you that, the politicians really should be talking about this more. Let's come to Asia. How do you think Asia is faring in terms of its cities? I've covered cities for more than 10 years, and I've seen, the climate agenda progressing, in some way, even if the politicians don't talk about it. The city planners and policymakers do look at the infrastructure of the Asian cities and see where they're going. But in terms of policy speak and ambition, and implementation, there is still this gap. And we see that across Asian cities that say they want to do this, but then the implementation is difficult for all sorts of reasons, and they're not really quite achieving the climate targets that they've set. So in your perspective, with your interaction of all the Asian cities, how are they faring on this?
So it's a bit kind of contradictory. So on the one hand, I could just speak for an hour about the litany of progress. There is huge developments, and indeed, in many things, Asia is completely driving the world. I think particularly on what's happened on vehicle electrification in China, it is way ahead of the rest of the world, and now driving global markets. It's really, if you look in Latin America now, There are now more electric buses on the roads in Latin America than the whole of North America, than the whole of the United States and Canada combined, and every single one of them was manufactured in China. And the reason for that is the European manufacturers who previously mostly supplied their buses said they couldn't provide electric buses for another 15 years in large numbers. They could do a few pilots, but not in large numbers, and the Chinese manufacturers just came at volume. So I think there's great progress on things like that. I think you can see real development in green building sector, lots of significant scale green developments around the world, as well as the signature buildings. I think we've seen some important shifts in terms of a mindset of putting climate policy at the heart of government. So most of our Asian cities have signed up to our Deadline 2020 programme, which is those targets of peak emissions, 2020 or so, 3 tonnes per person by 2030. However, the but is, actually, emissions are still going up. Yes. And actually, there are very few places that are really on target in Asia to that reduction to 3 tonnes per person by 2030, a real shift of the economy. I don't think it's in a kind of sort of disastrous place, though, because I think the general direction is moving in the right way. It just needs to go faster.
In your opinion, what do you think are the pain points that cities experience if they, in their plans to achieve their climate targets? What are some of the real obstacles that, despite ambition, they are unable to overcome?
Well, there's certainly the single biggest is changing the energy infrastructure. And it's still the case globally that whilst there is tremendous sort of almost exponential increase in renewable energy that's coming online every year and investment levels going through the roof, still there are tens, hundreds of billions of dollars being ploughed into the search for new fossil fuels and for tapping new reserves of oil and gas that we absolutely cannot risk burning. And therefore, and indeed energy systems, power systems being constructed right now across Asia and across the world that are intended to rely on coal and gas for another 25 to 30 years. And often in the case of cities, they're powerless to prevent that happening. And indeed, in some cases, you're now seeing, I can't think of an example in Asia, but certainly in Africa, we have African member cities who are taking their national governments to court to try and break out of what is currently the legal headlock that forces them to buy their power from the dirty, polluting national grid, and instead allowing them to develop their own city private grid so that they can directly invest in renewable energy themselves. And previously a constraint has been lack of access to capital from our city governments. We're now seeing that start to be overcome as they divest their pension funds and then start to set new rules for investment of those pension funds into clean energy and energy efficiency. And New York and London have really kind of led that movement with their very, very large multi-billion-dollar funds, but it's starting to move across the whole of C40 now.
That's really interesting. And actually, just last week, we hosted a event on cities with the Danish Embassy called Tomorrow Cities, Engineering the Energy Transition. And the energy transition is a huge story in the region right now. And you mentioned that, you had clean air in Beijing for 4 days, but, last week we were cleaner air, yeah.
I wouldn't call it clean yet.
Okay. But actually, if you look at the research, China is still building an enormous amount of coal capacity outside of Beijing now, because Beijing is where the politics is being played out. And if you look at the research, the coal capacity, the 3 biggest countries are all in Asia: China, India, and Vietnam. And so if we're facing this crisis like you have outlined, and the energy transition is so critical, why are we still not doing what we need to be doing? I mean, is there a solution? I mean, for those of us in this room who are all invested in this field, what is the solution?
Well, I do think here this is largely about mindset. Ultimately it's about politics and economics here, because there is no technical barrier to tackling climate change. This is a crisis that is entirely within humanity's ability to solve. And we not only know that we have technological solutions, but we know, because we see it particularly in the Nordic countries, one can see a pattern of political economy that will work and have thriving countries, some of the highest standards of living in the world, with ever-reducing ever increasing reliance on renewable energy and reducing emissions. But we're stuck in a paradigm, partly I think because of the predominance of neoliberal economics still, that is not allowing what needs to be a really significant public sector-led approach to tackling this crisis. I'm afraid we need planning. There's no way to tackle a problem that has to be dealt with over 30 or 40 years without a sober look at the direction that the whole of the country and the globe needs to take, and then systematically working through. And cities and governments have got to be much more about creating markets, setting markets, than just correcting market failure. And I think nowhere is that more true than in the energy sector. But also it's a situation where you really need to learn from the best practice in the world, rather than kind of carrying on as one always has been done, which is what we really try and do in C40. Is, quite often I'll be talking to a mayor who'll just say, but it's just simply not possible for my city to have an electric bus fleet. Maybe we can have 5. And then when you say, but Shenzhen's got 16,000. Oh, really? How did that happen? And then you take them to see it, and then the mindset can change. At the moment in the energy sector, there are very few energy companies that were fully fossil fuel that have completely transitioned into renewable energy. I think Dong has made that transition in Denmark. It's one of the very few that's really done it. But there is an example. There's Dong in Denmark, and we can take that and use that elsewhere.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I'm going to invite some questions, but I just one question, and I'm going to turn to Singapore. Singapore, I love my country. I think we're doing a lot of really good work policy-wise, and, even amongst businesses on climate action. But when you look at, things like Climate Tracker, which, Milad very kindly pointed out, the NDCs and the commitments that Singapore has made still puts them in the 4-degree scenario. And despite all the efforts on renewable energy, for example, we have a very ambitious solar program. We're still only 5% powered by renewable energy, 95% by natural gas and a bit of crude oil and a little bit of coal. So for a city like Singapore, how do you think we're faring on that? We have that ambition, obviously, and we're known to be like the sustainable city in Asia. But when you look at the per capita emissions and the huge crackers and the huge manufacturing facilities and the growth that Singapore wants to achieve, it seems like it's incompatible. Well, what are your views on that?
So I'm going to half dodge this because I have only just arrived, and clearly the numbers speak for themselves. Singapore's got a carbon footprint about 9 tonnes per person, and our research would say it needs to be 3 tonnes by 2030. So 2/3 of emissions have got to go in the space of 11 years. That's an extraordinary task. On the other hand, you look at the setup of Singapore as in many ways a model for the world. High density, compact living, very high quality public transport, lots of green space, incredible quality of life. The thing clearly here is the changing of the energy mix as a number one. It's a bit of a surprise to me just arriving for such a high-tech city that there are still so many dirty, polluting vehicles on the road, particularly having come from Oslo, which might be a kind of comparable kind of city, a bit smaller, and they were in Oslo plans to have its entire public transport system powered by renewable energy by the end of next year. But also they showed me sales of new privately owned cars, 76% of cars sold in Oslo last month were electric, 100% electric. So I think maybe that's a model Singapore needs to look at.
Yeah, you've hit a really sore point, because every single CLC lecture I moderate, somebody will ask the question about electric vehicles and why is Singapore not using more electric vehicles or cleaner vehicles? And speaking from my experience, I recently joined the board of ComfortDelGro, which is the world's, one of the world's largest land transport company, and they run buses and taxis and rails and things like that. And I had this very interesting conversation with the senior management about transforming the taxi fleet of 13,000 into electric. At the moment, out of 13,000, we have 4 electric cars and about 1,000 hybrids, which is not so bad. But the challenge in converting such a large fleet really is in infrastructure. And if there are no charging points across the city, then there's really you can't expect the taxi drivers to where are they going to charge their cars? And then the other more interesting thing is that one of its units actually derive half its revenue, $150 million, from fuel sales. So they sell diesel and petrol at a 30% discount to taxi drivers. But if you tell the shareholders, okay, we're going to electrify the fleet, and you're going to lose $150 million, the institutional investors like BlackRock and Aberdeen will come after the board of directors as well as the senior management. So these are very, very real-world practicalities and obstacles. And I've suggested maybe ComfortDelGro one day becoming an electricity generator, for example. But the transition is slow and very painful. So in your perspective, how can we accelerate that transition then?
Well, that's one of the I hadn't heard that one before, but the kind of perverse incentives that exist. And I bet if you sat down with the executives of the main shareholders, they'd all say they were completely committed on tackling climate change and they want to see fully electric fleets around the world. But shareholder duty, they've got to demand the maximum return from the company itself, and the management will feel responsible to deliver it. I mean, this is where I say I think from political leadership, one needs to see much more market intervention. It is the responsibility of politicians, armed with the evidence, the scientific evidence of climate change, not to sit back and accept a failed economic theory that the pure operation of markets is going to solve everything, when it quite clearly is not solving this major existential problem, and instead get markets working much more effectively and efficiently, and getting in good, strong regulation that will drive, which is exactly what's being done in Oslo. It's not some accident that they are shifting to an electric vehicle revolution. They've legislated for it. First, by abolishing sales tax on electric vehicles, so it's as cheap to buy a Tesla as it is to buy, I won't mention a brand, I don't want to diss any brand, but any normal kind of saloon car. But secondly, by publicly investing in the charging infrastructure. And by the way, the city government this is a revenue raising opportunity for them for the future. By getting to fully electric taxi fleets that charge up at city-owned, it's actually a public-private partnership, but city privately owned charging stations, they've got a guaranteed source of income for the future every time those taxis recharge.
So maybe the CLC M&D folks here can lobby the government to build electric stations faster. I'm going to invite our guests here this morning to engage with the conversation. Anybody has a burning question from the audience? I did tell you, Mark, it always takes a while for the audience to get warmed up. We have a question here. Would you identify yourself and your organization? Thank you.
Thank you. Camilla Fanning from the British High Commission working on climate and energy issues. Thanks very much for a really interesting lecture and discussion. I spent quite a lot of time going around the region trying to work with governments about how low carbon transition, which we've been mentioning, is actually the most fantastic economic opportunity of the 21st century. And I'm seeing that gradually that there is a recognition of that, but obviously the scale and pace of how quickly there can be that transition depends on the kind of economic and political circumstances of the country. And I'd just be interested, Mark, in your view as to whether you've also seen that growing recognition that this is a really positive opportunity for economic development, poverty alleviation, as well as all the sort of climate benefits, health benefits, environmental benefits. And is there more that governments and NGOs should be doing to make this message even clearer across this region?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. So I would say I can't think of a single mayor in network, and maybe more, but I can't think of a single mayor that doesn't see low carbon development at the centrepiece of their economic strategy for the city, and would, sees no future in a high carbon path, because just the numbers are, as you say, are just so clear that we now really understand the long-term economic costs of environmental pollution and how they're just knocking a percentage, 2, 3, 4% in some cases for our cities. Air pollution alone in some of our cities has been judged to reduce GDP by 1% a year. Traffic congestion by similar numbers. And putting the positive side, the places, mostly our member cities, are the big economic hubs of their country and the region. They're trying to attract international investment, and international investors and the best people internationally, they want to live in clean cities. They want to live in cities that have got great public transport that's easy to get around, and they want to work in buildings that they're proud to work in and have got high productivity because they've been designed well. And all of those things, they don't work back to coal-fired power stations and leaky buildings and lots of people driving around in polluting cars. They link back to high standards of building fabric, well insulated, able to run on relatively low amounts of power from clean power, mass transit, cycling and walking. So I think that the green economy story, we just should keep telling it all and all the time, because it's true, and the evidence is clear every day. We know a major part of C40's programme is just looking in each city at the social and economic benefits of the programmes they've already got in place and perhaps haven't been able to quantify. You know, one of the things that's a capacity constraint often, and particularly I think we see it in our Asian cities as much as anywhere else, is there just often aren't the units in the city government that do that kind of analysis. So when it comes to decision making, the standard cost benefit analysis isn't giving a true picture of the benefits of the green investment. And I think we drive a lot more investment out of the polluting and into the clean if we had just a little bit more of that kind of economic analysis that shows the benefits.
Thank you very much, Mark. Any other questions over there? Okay, quite a few now. Esther?
Hi, I'm Esther, working with CDL. He's a green developer in Singapore and promoting sustainability for 24 years. I had a root shock last night when we were on the panel and debating on whether sustainability should be a top priority in investment decision, okay? Talking to 280 retail investors. And the final vote showed that more than 50% think it should not be a priority. It was a root shock to me because I thought we've been doing a lot, you know. And SGX did a good job making it mandatory for listed companies to produce a sustainability report. But from the audience, feedback is like, oh, they don't really care. You know, I don't know how to read sustainability report anyway, you know. So I think we are too slow. We are only talking, mainly engaging the converts in most instances. We need to break out and reach out. We thought we are really, you know, moving the needle, but actually what it showed me yesterday, all these are shareholders, the retail investors. The institutional investors may be moving a bit more, but I think we need to, you know, speed up. Otherwise, we have no hope. There's no planet, no people. There won't be profits for business, you know. So I think that, but on the same day, I have given a lecture at NUS Business School, and I was very encouraged. That was in the morning, that all the young students, they were very concerned, and they show a lot more. And my hope is on the people's power, people's voice, especially the millennial, and they are the one who is going to change the world. And but I think financial can do a little, a bit more, not little. Actually, they have to step up. Whether they're the investors or the financier, they have to move faster. Otherwise, businesses, you know, can't change the world alone. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Esther. I think, Mark, you know, this is a fair point about the finance industry. How much is that really kind of moving with the ambition of cities to solve the problem?
So I think this is a problem. So there are certainly there's some tremendous innovation in the investor community, and there are a growing number of fantastic green funds that are making available capital for developing low carbon projects. That is most definitely true. But if I compare the mindset change and the progress in the investor community compared with the business community writ large, where there's been tremendous progress over the last few years and huge leadership across companies, across all sectors across the world, and I think a real kind of shift to realising that the low carbon economy is where the success is in the future, or in the political sphere amongst mayors and regional leaders and one or two governments where there absolutely is leadership. I just don't see that in the investor sector writ large. And apologies, I'm sure there are people here who hopefully will say I'm wrong on this, but in a sense I think that's not surprising, in that, you know, the incentives within the investment community are generally about following the market and doing a bit better, not about fundamental change. And indeed, there's a general mindset of trust in oneself to be the one to get out before the disaster happens. So when you look at the crazy way in which the real estate market in Miami, a city that is really seriously threatened with not existing because of rising flood levels, and yet prices still go through the roof, or the investment in pretty much any, the coastal areas of pretty much any of the major cities which I work in areas that really should be floodplain and where luxury development is still taking place, because there's just such huge capital flows to go into that, because the immediate profits are so large. And you talk to any of those, the investors are putting money in there, they understand the risk, but they understand the risk, but they see it as a risk to that development in 10 or 20 years, and they're going to have taken their capital out within 5 years. And I think this is a real problem. The way around it here, it has to be for both the kind of thin end of the private sector investors that really get it to take leadership, and we've seen tremendous leadership from people like Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, talking about stranded assets, or Mike Bloomberg. But also here again, it's the public sector's going to have to take some lead. It's the public pension funds that are so large and the public sector investors that are so big that need to set a direction that shifts the market, and then the private capital will start to follow. And I'd love to be disagreed with on that, and maybe there are people on here who are far more expert and will disagree, but that's my sense.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think we had a couple of questions at the back. Can we get the microphone to them? Thank you. We'll take both at the same time. No, the back first? Yeah, they raised their hands first.
Hi, I'm Rihanna, and I'm a student at one of the international schools, United World College. And first, my friend and I are shocked that I think we're the only students here, as this is our future. And like you mentioned, we couldn't protest at school last week, so we just had to hold an awareness day. And we had protest signs around the school, but we couldn't actually demonstrate. But we are really passionate about this, so I was wondering, I know that the Singaporean government is very eager to work with organizations that further its promise of the green city, but I was wondering that in your experience with the lectures and workshops and experiences that C40 does with cities around the world, I was wondering do you think that it's a vital part of what you do to work with the governments and IGOs and NGOs, or is it more efficient to work solely through C40?
Okay, thank you for your question. We'll take the other one as well. Your friend had a question too?
It's kind of not related to what she said, so maybe you want to answer.
It's okay, you can go ahead and we'll take both.
Okay, I'm also a student at UWC SEA, and my question is a little bit more broad. And so basically 40% of all carbon emissions, and I am aware that there's some controversy surrounding these figures, are coming from the agriculture industry. And you were talking a lot about, obviously, gas and coal and the transportation sector, but actually the agriculture sector accounts for a significantly larger amount of carbon emissions, but this is not really ever brought up. We study environmental studies and economics and global politics, but this is never something that arises. Greta Thunberg, who, we think of ourselves as part of her movement, she is plant-based. I'm plant-based as well. And we kind of look towards the agriculture industry as kind of rapidly changing, but this is never part of the politics. And so I'm kind of wondering what everyone, I guess, in here's stance is on this, and how large of a role it plays in Singaporean politics, if at all.
Thank you so much for your question. Any other students in the room? I just want to have a show of hand. Okay, great. You want to take the third student?
Yeah, okay. Difficult questions you want.
Okay, let's hear from the third student, and then we'll come back to you, Mark.
Hi, I'm Eric, former Vice President of the Environmental Law Students Association at NUS Law, currently final year law student as well. First, maybe a correction point or two. There was no physical protest in Singapore on Fridays for Future or Climate Strike, but there was an online petition / social media campaign, which is, how we do things in Singapore. And so there is another student here. But I think the more important question is, Singapore is has a very unique governance structure. We are almost a 1 or 1.5 level government. We don't have municipal government and the national government. They are one and the same. But that's not really the case in any other country. Most countries will have a national government, a set of municipal governance, and you might have the states as well, like in the US. And what it seems to me is that cities are very much ahead of the curve. They are very much progressive. They are mostly multicultural, very cosmopolitan. They are very much invested in climate action. But I'm not seeing that this horizontal discussion that C40 has and is building is very good. But it doesn't seem to be flowing upwards. There's no vertical discussion. In fact, we're seeing the rise of populism. We're seeing the US has already started to pull out of Paris. Brazil threatening to pull out. Even Indonesia recently stated that because of the palm oil ban in the EU, they are also considering pulling out of Paris. So what is C40 doing or has been doing to foster this vertical discussion as well, such that the Paris Agreement will not fall apart and states and cities will not be pulled out of Paris against their will, just as we are seeing with the US right now?
Thank you very much for your question, Mark. All the questions from our future leaders.
Well, there are many ways to protest. So, I think the most significant thing for me. So this is kind of trying. Partly, I will answer each point specifically, but I think the most significant thing for me about the school climate strikes it's a bit like, you know, in the tale of the little boy who shouts out that the emperor is not wearing any clothes. It has opened up the space again to talk in a realistic way about climate change, because the message of the climate strikes has just been so absolutely unremittingly clear. We're heading to disaster. Why are you not doing anything about it? And I find that really helpful and inspiring and kind of uplifting, even though it's a very shameful thing. I feel equal parts shameful that as an adult who's been working in this profession for years, it's been such a failure that it's taking school children to have to stand up and tell us what we should have been doing anyway. But I really, you know, a slight anecdote, but it was very noticeable I've been to many of them around the world now, but in Oslo, the government advised parents not to allow their children to attend the strike, the national government. The mayor of Oslo instead came out publicly and said he supported the strike. Perhaps unwisely, the Norwegian climate minister nevertheless went along to speak at the demonstration and was roundly booed, as you might expect, having said that they didn't want the strikes. The mayor of Oslo just didn't speak and just walked around talking to people and was kind of cheered everywhere he went. And I guess maybe that's the way. I think this is a moment where adults, political leaders, all leaders should be listening to what school children are saying rather than trying to tell them something. I think in terms of the sort of question about what's the most efficient way to work, whether it's through kind of NGOs or through the kind of collaboration in C40, actually one needs all of those things. Our view in C40 has been that when it comes down to it, with a relatively small resource, 200 or so staff at C40, the most efficient way that we can work is to leverage the experience that already exists within city governments. So most of what we do is getting one mayor to talk to another mayor and inspire them, or one transport official to talk to another, or taking them to see what each other is doing. And actually, it's a kind of big virtual consultancy, but it's made up of the hundreds of thousands of employees of those city governments, and indeed their partners in private firms and in citizens, and getting them kind of working together as a network. And that does seem to be having a lot of success, because we can see a real, pretty much every year, we measure the action that's being taken. It's doubling every year. 30 or so of our cities have now reached peak emissions and are going down. And it's not fast enough against the science and the scale of the problem, but it's moving faster than most of the world. And indeed, I think the question on agriculture is very, very well taken and completely right. And it's not just the kind of emissions, 30% of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. In most countries, 70 to 80% of water consumption is to feed agriculture as well, which has kind of many knock-on environmental consequences. So we've not published it fully yet, but we've just done at the moment, we measure the emissions of all of our cities based on the standard international methodology, which looks at the emissions produced within the physical geographical boundary of the city. We're now doing an analysis that looks at it based on what is consumed within the city, even if it's manufactured or brought in from elsewhere. In the case of many of our members, that means their emissions increases twice, 5 times, in one city's case 15 times bigger than it would on the conventional measure, and a very significant part of that is about food consumption. And the very difficult thing on this for lots of our mayors and citizens is the biggest problem is just the rate of meat consumption. And I think there is no way forward for humanity unless we massively reduce meat consumption and indeed fish consumption and largely moved to a plant-based diet. It's not a very popular message. I have a plant-based diet myself, so it sounds a bit kind of pious, but and feel very healthy on it. But we now have in C40, we only serve, we won't serve meat at any of our events, but more than that, our staff are travelling all around the world and working, and obviously we pay their expenses, but we won't pay their expenses for consuming meat. So they can only have a vegetarian or pescatarian diet. And you're seeing some cities really start to do this. Copenhagen has started in the land of Danish bacon, has started introducing meat-free meals, and I think they may even be moving to entirely meat-free meals in the publicly provided meals. The same is true in Curitiba in Brazil, in all sorts of places around the world. So I think it's exactly the right thing to focus on. And what was the last one? Oh, the rise of populism. God.
Or rather the vertical conversation.
Yes, and the vertical conversation. Well, I mean, this is of course a very serious threat. You know, the Paris Agreement was a massive step forward, and it is now completely stuck again because the president of the most powerful nation in the world doesn't believe in climate change. And it's pretty much as simple as that. The new election, new president in Brazil is a very, very serious thing for the world. If his policies to allow the further destruction of the Brazilian rainforest are delivered at the scale at which he is talking about, it would release into the atmosphere, it would reduce the amount of carbon that is sequestered by the Amazon rainforest to the equivalent of about 13 gigatons a year, which is 3 times the emissions of the United States. So it's an extraordinarily serious issue. So in C40, I mean, we are primarily focused on mayors, but increasingly we're working with our mayors to do the 2 parts of vertical integration. The first, which is really engaging with citizens, so that there is a popular demand for climate programs within cities, and the mayors get support when they're under attack. We've seen lots of mayors recently come under very severe attack for doing the right thing. The mayor of Paris, for example, pedestrianised 4-lane highway along the banks of the Seine and came under a really well-organised social media attack that was convincing people that the air pollution was getting worse because she'd pedestrianised parts of Paris on the bizarre kind of notion that it was causing more congestion and therefore more fumes. Turned out to be no truth whatsoever, but got a lot of build-up, and you could trace that back to some of the automotive companies sponsoring that social media campaign. So we need citizens to engage and support mayors when they're doing the right thing, but we very much do engage with national governments also, although we're not a campaigning organisation. But our attitude is to work with the governments that are really taking climate change seriously. So we receive funding from the British government, from the German government, from the Danish government, and work very closely with them around the world, work very closely with Singapore, and indeed are happy to work with any government that's really taking climate change seriously.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think we have time for just one last question, if there's any burning ones in the audience. Wow, there are 4. I'm not sure if we've got time for that, but maybe if we just keep your question to the point, we can kind of address everyone's.
Hi, I'm Hui Ying. I'm from Foodscape Collective. And I really echo the urgency that many people have expressed earlier, including what the 2 students themselves talked about. I'm really glad one of them brought up agriculture. And I think I want to link this to a larger question about how governments and private companies, corporations are beginning to see the shift towards the potential for sustainable land investments, because that's really where, when we think about property and urban development and the kind of new urban city models that are coming up across the world, that cities themselves are responsible for. Singapore itself is responsible for coming up with new forms of city models in China and India. And there's a kind of responsibility there. So how is C40 or other cities beginning to think about the potential for sustainable land investments that incorporate more sustainable forms of urban or peri-urban agriculture alongside low-carbon energy possibilities? And how does that include developers, and especially green developers that are already beginning to look forward towards that? And that brings in the earlier question, which is about how do financiers support something like this?
Thank you. Can we have the next question and keep it really short, like a few seconds if possible?
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
My name is Mark Chung. I'm a consultant in infrastructure planning. My question is like this, very simple. I've taken a note of the list of cities in C40. Indonesia has only one city there, Jakarta. I know for a fact that many cities are urbanizing very rapidly. Why are so many other cities that are rapidly urbanizing not in your list and not in your radar? Perhaps you can enlighten us on how you propose to cover these cities, and because these young cities are the sort of cities you want to catch them early before they have gone the wrong way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think one last question here. If we can get the microphone, yeah, thank you.
Yuki Architect. I have a question on leadership and climate refugees. Mark mentioned about carrying capacity. Each city has its own carrying capacity, overburdened by human migration, reduced food supply. What happens when climate change causes disasters and trigger the influx of an exponential rise of climate refugees to the city? So as mayor, as leaders of the country, how do you deal with those carrying capacity and climate refugees from external?
Thank you very much. Keep it short, then we can take one final one.
Yeah, I work in the energy efficiency sector, and I was at a talk a few years ago where someone from the ADB was speaking, and I said, I don't see it happening at scale, energy efficiency. And she said, the only place it's happening at scale is China. And it's because of a combination of carrots and sticks. My question is, are you seeing some of the cities starting to mandate energy efficiency improvements, and not only for new construction, but for all the existing buildings in cities?
Thank you very much, Mark. You have a lot to cover in a very short 2-3 minute wrap up. Sustainable and investments, urbanization, leadership with climate refugees, energy efficiency.
Okay, we're going in reverse. So yes, on the energy efficiency mandating. From memory, we've got 15 C40 cities that have committed that 100% of their public buildings will be fully retrofitted by 2030, and then starting to roll that out across private buildings as well, largely through mandates where they have the powers to do so. Probably the biggest by scale example of that is the New York building mandate that is just about to come into force, which sets it's about a 30-40% reduction in energy consumption per building across oh god, the number's just gone out of my head now, but it's something like 30% of the occupied floor space in New York, accompanied by extremely large fines for failure to deliver. So they've had years of doing the carrot, the stick is now coming in. And I was really impressed in China at the seriousness with which that is being taken and looked at. And I think you will see similar policies starting to come in China very soon. They've been experimenting with cap and trade for building emissions at the moment. I mean, refugees, so I 100% agree with that this as a growing issue. Indeed, the Mayor's Migration Council has just been set up, which C40 is a partner in, to start to look at that. I mean, in some of our cities, it's already a big issue. A man in Jordan, a quarter of the population are refugees, driven by the immediate issue is conflict, but lots of those conflicts have their roots in climate change and failed crops and areas that have become uninhabitable. To be honest, what is the answer at the moment? One doesn't know, other than it requires cities to really seriously start to plan for this, because to deal with it in a humane way and be able to welcome and take care of people who are fleeing consequences of things that were caused largely elsewhere, and they'll be fleeing from the devastated regions to the western cities largely that have caused the problem of climate change. I think we have some responsibility, but how to cope with what is going to be, whatever happens now, is going to be a significant flows of people all around the world. I think is going to become a major thing that mayors need to focus on. I'm sorry I can't give a better answer. On the kind of what to do on rapid urbanisation, well, I think the simple answer is we kind of do know the models that work. So the cities that are designed to be compact and dense and based on mass transit, cycling and walking function. The ones that are designed have been allowed to develop kind of organically and sprawl and assume that people are going to get around in private cars just don't work anymore. And you really see that when you look at the GDP figures. You compare Copenhagen, which has very much had that kind of compact, dense, mass transit, cycling, walking model with Houston in Texas, both member cities of ours. But Houston spends 15% of its GDP on transport. Copenhagen spends less than 5%. There's just a massive economic deficit to the cities that are sprawling. So I think trying to constrain that sprawling model is the most important thing. And then finally, on this sustainable land investment, this is a really interesting one. So we have a food network food and agriculture, or food systems network in C40. It's the last network that we created. It's already the most popular. It's the one that most cities, over half of the membership, are now engaged in. And partly that's because some sort of surprising things, in many of our cities, large amounts of food production takes place within the metropolitan area. In Addis Ababa, half of all the food consumed within the city is produced within the boundary of the metropolitan city, and long may that continue. So we have lots of cities now that are investing in urban agriculture. Curitiba in Brazil has got huge programs of urban farming, at the kind of low-tech to the high-tech of using facades of buildings to grow food, or in New York they're using the river to grow food. And I think, one is, in very dense cities, one is never going to get to a situation when you can feed the population from production within the city. But with more of a plant-based diet, you can provide more of it and provide more security. But certainly looking out into that peri-urban and really looking at the emissions footprint right down the supply chain and seeing how city investment can encourage organic agriculture in the surrounds of the city and make it easy for that food to be brought in and sold rather than the long distance travel of often, and of course trying to squeeze out of the market the terrible processed foods that destroy health as well as having a high carbon footprint. And I think we see city governments taking much more of a lead on that over the next few years.
Thank you very much, Mark. And on the subject of food, I'm sure everyone is hungry for lunch. And I'd just like to say that, if you get the opportunity to try the Impossible Foods burger that actually just launched in Singapore a few weeks ago, plant-based, amazing, is the best-selling item at Potato Head. And I'm trying to convince them to set up the Asia factory in Singapore. So hopefully we'll see some progress. Thank you very much, Mark. Yeah. Thank you, Mark and Jessica, for the lively discussion. And thank you all for the active participation. There's a point mentioned by Mark which I like, which is that there's actually no technical barriers to climate change, right? We all have the technical solutions. What we need is to get the politics and the economics right. May I now invite Dr. Hee Lee Min, Director for CLC, to maybe present a token of appreciation to Mark and Jessica. Lee Min, please. Thank you for being a part of today's event. We hope you enjoyed the lecture. There's also another lecture this afternoon on what's next for conservation. So if you're interested, you'll be at Parliament House. For the latest on our lecture series or publications, do visit our website at www.clc.gov.sg. Thank you and enjoy your weekend.